The second plate had been sitting on that shelf for so long that the dust around it had formed a kind of halo, a pale ring on the wood that made it look almost sacred, like something left at an altar by a man who did not quite know what God he was praying to. Clyde Easton was 36 years old in the autumn of 1882, and he had lived alone in the same two-room cabin outside of Harrow Creek, New Mexico Territory, for nearly half of his life. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with hands that were rough from fence wire and saddle leather, and the particular kind of loneliness that makes a man work himself past exhaustion just so he can fall asleep without thinking too hard. His hair was dark with threads of early gray at the temples, and his eyes were the color of the hills in October, that warm amber brown that sits somewhere between gold and rust. He was not an ugly man. The women in town had noticed him for years, had sent their daughters past his fence on invented errands and smiled at him from beneath their bonnets during Sunday service. Clyde had always smiled back. He was not cold, not mean, not indifferent to kindness. He simply had not felt anything land in the right place since the day he nailed that second plate to the shelf inside the cupboard, and had no earthly reason that he could name for doing it. He had done it in the spring of 1868 when he was 22 years old and had just finished building the cabin. He had ridden into town with a short list of supplies, had stood in Birch's general store with the smell of sawdust still on his coat, and had picked up one tin plate for himself. Then, without a word to anyone, without a thought he could fully account for, he had picked up a second one. The storekeeper, old Pete Birch, had glanced at him sideways. Clyde had said nothing, had paid for both, had ridden home with them wrapped in brown paper inside his saddlebag. He had put his plate on the table. He had put the second one in the cupboard. He had cooked supper for one, eaten it standing at the window looking out at the darkening range, and never once opened the cupboard to use that second plate for himself. It was not a deliberate habit. It was simply something that felt wrong to disturb. The plate stayed where he put it. The years moved around it like water around a stone. In the 14 years that followed, Clyde Easton built his cattle operation from 16 head to over 200. He hired 2 ranch hands, brothers named Eli and Walt Summers, who slept in the bunkhouse he raised in 1874. He mended fences, weathered droughts, lost 20 cattle to a fever in the summer of 1879, rebuilt, and kept going. He rode into Harrow Creek every 2 weeks for supplies and mail. He drank exactly 1 whiskey at the Silver Spur Saloon on those days, sat at the bar, spoke to people when they spoke to him, and rode home before dark. He was a man of deep routine, and the routine was not miserable. There were mornings when the light came up over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and turned the whole range into something that felt like a painting, and he stood at the fence post with his coffee and felt something so close to contentment that it almost passed. There were evenings when the coyotes sang in the arroyo and the stars came out so thick and low that the sky seemed to be pressing down toward the earth with affection. He was not an unhappy man. He was simply a man who had set a place at a table that was not yet filled and who had stopped asking himself why. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of October. Clyde had not written any letter to any woman. He had not placed any advertisement in any newspaper or answered any matrimonial column. He was clear on this point when he turned the envelope over in his hands on the porch of the post office, while the autumn wind lifted the red dust off the street and carried it in slow spirals toward the far end of town. His name was written on the front in a handwriting he did not recognize, careful, a little cramped, like someone who had learned their letters from a strict schoolteacher and never quite unlearned the caution. He opened it there on the street and read it twice. The letter was from a woman named Naomi Quinn, writing from Abilene, Kansas. She was 28 years old, she wrote. She had been the schoolteacher at a small settlement outside of Abilene for 4 years before the school was closed when the settlement contracted, and most of the families moved west. She was not writing in response to any advertisement, she explained. She was writing because she had been given his name and address by a man named Henry Briggs, who had been a cattle driver on Clyde's operation 3 years prior, and who had told her, apparently, that Clyde Easton was the most decent man he had met between the Missouri River and the Rio Grande, that his land was good, that his house was clean, and that he had never once heard the man raise his voice in anger at a person or an animal. She wrote that she was not a romantic fool. She understood the practical nature of what she was suggesting. She was a woman alone with a small amount of savings, no living family, and a strong desire to put her hands to work on something that would last. She taught children. She knew how to keep house. She was not afraid of hard labor or difficult weather. She was asking, plainly and without excess decoration, whether he would be willing to correspond with her and whether there might be a future worth discussing. She signed it, respectfully, Naomi Quinn. Clyde stood on the street of Harrow Creek for a long time after reading it. The wind tugged at the corner of the letter. Down the street, 2 horses stood hitched at the rail outside the Silver Spur, swishing their tails in patient rhythm. A woman in a gray dress crossed the far end of the street with a basket on her arm and did not look up. The sky was the particular pale blue of October, the kind that feels like the last warmth before the long cold comes. He folded the letter back into the envelope and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, close to his chest, and rode home. He did not write back that evening. He cooked his supper salt pork and beans, and the last of a loaf he had baked on Sunday, and ate it at the table with the lamp turned up and the letter lying flat beside his plate. He read it a 3rd time, then a 4th. He was not a man who made decisions quickly, and he understood that this was not a small decision. But somewhere under the careful reading, under the practical weighing of what Henry Briggs had apparently told this woman, and what that said about her judgment, under the consideration of the winter coming on and the extra work, and the risk of bringing a stranger onto land he had shaped with his own hands for 14 years, there was something else. Something warm and slightly electric that moved through him like the first thunder of a storm still a long way off. He wrote back the following morning. He was not a flowery writer. He said he had received her letter, that he appreciated its honesty, that Henry Briggs had been a reliable man and he was inclined to trust his judgment. He described his operation, the land, the cattle, the 2 hands, the house, the distance from town, the winters, the summers, the water rights he held on the creek. He described himself without flattery. Tall, 36, solitary by habit if not entirely by preference, not a church-going man though he respected those who were, a man who believed in the value of quiet and the virtue of honest work. He said he would like to continue writing to her, and that if it seemed right to them both after a few exchanges, she would be welcome to come and visit, with no obligation in either direction, and form her own opinion. He sealed the letter, rode into town, and posted it. They wrote back and forth for 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, Clyde Easton discovered that Naomi Quinn had opinions, strong ones, and not the kind that were designed to please. She had opinions about the education system in the territories, which she found criminally underfunded and inconsistent. She had opinions about the cattle industry and the way it was transforming the land, which she expressed with a careful intelligence that told him she had been paying attention to the world around her for a long time. She had a sense of humor that was dry and quiet and easy to miss if you were not reading carefully, and once he started reading carefully, he found it in almost every letter, and it made him smile in a way that felt unfamiliar, like using a muscle that had been resting too long. She also had a history that she gave him a piece of a time. Her parents had both died of cholera when she was 11, in 1865, at a camp in Missouri on their way west. She had been taken in by her mother's sister, a woman in Abilene who was not unkind but was not warm either, a woman who believed that practical education was a woman's best protection in the world, and who had made sure Naomi could read, cipher, sew, cook, and manage household accounts before she was 15. The aunt had died in 1877, leaving Naomi a small amount of money, the teaching position she had already been holding for 2 years, and a house she sold to fund her survival while she figured out what came next. What came next, apparently, was a letter to a cattle rancher in New Mexico territory whom she had heard about from a cattle drover at a bar in Abilene who had spoken of him the way people speak of places they feel lucky to have been. In his fourth letter, Clyde wrote, "I do not know what I expected you to be, but I find that whatever I expected was considerably less than what you are." It took him 3 drafts to write that sentence. He was not a man who said things like that easily. But he sent it. Her reply 2 weeks later said, "I am not sure whether to be flattered or worried about the quality of your expectations, Mr. Easton. I think perhaps both." He laughed out loud at his kitchen table when he read it, and Eli Summers, who had come in to ask about the south fence, stared at him from the doorway with an expression of pure bewilderment. Clyde was not, as a rule, a man who laughed at his mail. By the end of November, she had agreed to come. She would arrive on the 3rd of December by the stage from Santa Fe, which connected twice weekly to Harrow Creek. She was not committing to anything, she wrote. Neither was he. She was simply going to come and see the land and the man and the life, and make an informed decision like an adult woman with a clear head, and he was going to do the same. She said she expected him to be honest with her, and she intended to be honest with him, and if it turned out they were not suited, she would find lodging in town and help with the school if there was one and build something from there. She was not coming as someone's answer to loneliness. She was coming to find out if the truth of a person matched the letters they sent. He read that last part several times, feeling something that he recognized eventually as respect. He had not quite expected to respect her more for saying it, but he did. He spent 2 weeks before her arrival doing things to the cabin that he had been meaning to do for years. He replaced 3 boards on the porch that had been rotting at the edges. He sealed the gap in the north wall where the wind had been coming in since 1879. He cleaned the kitchen with a thoroughness that made Walt Summers tell Eli that the boss had clearly lost his mind. He bought a piece of calico print fabric at Birch's General Store and tacked it up at the window for a curtain, then stared at it for 10 minutes wondering if it looked foolish, then left it up because the color was nice, a deep blue with small white flowers, and because the morning light did something warm with it that he did not want to cover up again. He did not touch the cupboard. He was not sure why. He stood in front of it on the morning of December 1st, 2 days before she was to arrive, with his cleaning rag in his hand, and he opened it and looked at the second plate and did not move it. The dust had collected in a soft ring on the wood around its edge. The plate itself was clean tin, simply made, unremarkable. He reached in and picked it up, felt the weight of it, smooth and cool in his palm. 14 years. He set it back on the shelf, closed the cupboard, and went to polish the stove. The stage from Santa Fe was 2 hours late on the 3rd of December, which was a Tuesday, and also one of the coldest days Harrow Creek had seen in years. Clyde stood outside the stage office with his hat pulled low and the collar of his coat turned up, watching the street. The wind was coming hard off the mountains, pushing grit and dead leaves in low, fast lines across the frozen mud. 3 other men were waiting for the same stage, a drummer with a sample case, an elderly man collecting his sister from somewhere east, and Deputy Sheriff Tanner, who collected mail for the sheriff's office on stage days. When the stage rolled in, creaking and swaying with its team of 4 horses blowing hard in the cold, Clyde felt his heartbeat do something it had not done in years. He told himself it was the cold. He pulled his hat down another inch and watched the door. She stepped down from the stage and he knew her immediately, though he had never seen her face. He knew her because she stepped out of that rocking, creaking stage onto the frozen street with her traveling bag in one hand, and she looked around at the town of Harrow Creek, at its one main street, and its weathered storefronts and its bare cottonwood trees with the sky white and cold behind them, and she did not look disappointed. She looked like a person assessing, like someone who had come to learn a thing and was already learning it, taking it in with those dark eyes that moved over everything steadily, missing nothing. She was not what the novels would have called a great beauty, though she was pretty in the way that some women are when there is intelligence in their face, dark hair pinned under a gray wool hat, a face with strong bones, and a mouth that looked like it was used to being thoughtful, wearing a practical brown coat that had been well made and was now well worn. She was not tall, maybe 5'4" or so, but she held herself like someone who took up exactly as much space as she was entitled to and was not ashamed of it. She looked in his direction, and their eyes met, and something happened that Clyde Easton would spend a long time afterward trying to find the right word for. It was not lightning, though that is the word people use. It was more like recognition, like a sound you hear and know even when you cannot name it yet. He walked toward her and took off his hat. "Miss Quinn," he said. "Mr. Easton," she said. Her voice was lower than he had imagined from the letters, steady. There was a slight tiredness in it from the journey, but under that a warmth that was unmistakable. "Welcome to Harrow Creek," he said. "I am sorry about the weather." She looked up at the white sky and then back at him with a small, careful smile. "I am from Kansas," she said. "I know what cold is." He took her traveling bag before she could protest and led her to where his horse and the spare were tied at the post. She looked at the horses with the eye of someone who knew them, ran a hand along the neck of the smaller gray, murmured something to it that made it lean into her palm. "That is Pepper," he said. "She is gentle, if you are comfortable in the saddle." "I am comfortable enough," she said, and swung up with a competence that told him she had not been flattering herself. They rode out of town toward the ranch, and the wind came at them from the west, and Clyde told her about the land they were crossing, whose holdings were whose, what the creek looked like in spring, where the best grazing was. He talked because he was nervous, and he was surprised to discover that, because he had not been nervous about much in a very long time. She listened and asked good questions, practical ones about water rights and winter feed and the nearest doctor and school. The school question was the one that landed differently. "There is a school in town," he said, 3 miles. "Miss Alderton teaches it. She has been there 2 years, but I have heard she is leaving in the spring. Getting married and going east." Naomi was quiet for a moment, and he could see her turning that over. She did not say anything then, just looked out at the land, at the brown grass and the dark rocks and the mountains sitting blue and cold along the horizon, and he could see her placing herself in it, trying it on the way you hold a coat up to your shoulders before you buy it. He opened the cabin door for her and stood back. She went in first. She stood in the center of the main room for a moment, turning slowly, taking in the stove and the table and the 2 chairs and the new calico curtain in the window. She looked at the curtain for a moment, and he watched something move across her face that he could not quite read. Then she went to the window and looked out at the yard and the bunkhouse and the range beyond it in the gray afternoon light. "It is a good view," she said. "In the morning," he said, "the light comes up over that ridge there and puts itself all over the mountains. It is something to see." She turned from the window and looked at him. "You love this place," she said. It was not a question. "I do," he said. "I have never not loved it." "Good," she said simply, and that was all, and somehow it was enough. He had prepared the main room for her to sleep, laying his extra blankets on the narrow cot he had brought in and set against the far wall, and he himself would sleep in the second room, which served as his bedroom year-round. He cooked supper that first evening while she sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, and they talked the way people do when they are still feeling the shape of each other out, carefully and with attention, asking questions that are really other questions underneath. She told him about Abilene, about the school and the children, some of whom had barely eaten enough to think, and yet came in every morning with such fierce willingness to learn that it had broken her heart, regularly, in the best possible way. She talked about a boy named Theodore who had learned to read at age 9, and had taken it like a man who has been given a rope, and hauls himself up hand over hand, breathless and determined. She talked about his face when he first read an entire paragraph aloud without stopping. Her voice changed when she talked about those children, softened and sharpened at the same time, the way a fire does when the wind touches it. Clyde listened. He was a very good listener. It was one of the things the solitude had given him, the capacity to attend to what was being said without rushing toward the next thing he wanted to say himself. When they ate, it was from his one set of plates, as he had given her the proper one, and taken the battered extra from the shelf by the stove. He did not think about the cupboard that evening. She slept, and he lay in his room in the dark listening to the wind on the roof, feeling the strange new weight of another person's breathing in the house, and found that it was not uncomfortable. It was, in fact, the opposite of uncomfortable. He had been so long without it that he had forgotten it was a thing you could miss. The second day she was up before him. He came out of his room to find the stove already lit and the coffee already made and her at the table with her coat on over her nightgown, writing something in a small leather notebook. She looked up at him without embarrassment, completely unself-conscious, and said, "Good morning. The coffee is ready. I hope it is strong enough. I tend to make it strong." It was very strong. He drank it and said nothing about that because it was exactly how he liked it. They rode the property together that morning, him taking her over the southern range where most of the cattle were, and the creek, which was running low but clear in the cold, and the north pasture where he was thinking of expanding the herd come spring. She asked about the Navajo families who had land further north, and he told her what he knew, that there were several families who had been there longer than any of the white settlers, and had a complicated and unjust history with the territory government that he was not proud of on behalf of his country. He said it simply, without performance, and she looked at him with something that was more than approval. It was the look of someone who is learning that a person's character is consistent in its better instincts. "Henry Briggs told me you were decent," she said, looking out over the north pasture. "I thought that might be one man's opinion. And now," he said. "I am forming my own," she said, and she smiled. And it was the first full smile he had seen from her. The careful, closed one had been there from the beginning. But this one reached her eyes, and it was like watching the sun come out from behind a cloud and realizing you had been colder than you knew. That evening, while he was brushing down Pepper in the stable and she had gone inside ahead of him, she found the cupboard. He came in to find her standing in front of it with the door open, the lantern light throwing a warm yellow glow across the room. She was holding the second plate. She turned it over in her hands the way he had on the morning before she arrived, feeling its weight. She did not put it down when he came in. He stopped in the doorway. She looked at him across the room with those steady, dark eyes. "There are 2 plates in here," she said, "but you only have the one setting at the table." "Yes," he said. "When did you put that one there?" she asked. He came in out of the cold and shut the door and took off his coat and hat and hung them on the peg, and he did not know exactly why he was going to answer her honestly except that it seemed dishonest to do anything else. "The day I built this cabin," he said. 1868. She looked at him. Then she looked at the plate. "Why?" "I do not know," he said. "I have thought about it more than I should probably admit. I have never been able to give you an answer beyond that. I walked into Birch's store to buy 1 plate and I bought 2, and I put 1 in the cupboard and I have never taken it out." She was quiet for a long moment, turning the plate in her hands. The lantern hissed softly. Outside, the wind moved through the juniper trees. 14 years, she said softly. 14 years, he said. She looked up at him then, and there was something in her face that was different from anything he had seen there in 2 days of watching, something open and careful and wondering all at once. Like a person standing at the edge of a country, they have been told stories about their whole life, and are only now actually seeing with their own eyes. "I suppose," she said slowly, "that is either the strangest coincidence I have ever encountered." She paused. "Or it is not a coincidence at all." He did not say anything. He was not sure there was anything to say that would not be too much. He simply looked at her across the lamplight, this woman who had come across 400 miles of cold plain to stand in his kitchen and hold a plate he had put on a shelf 14 years ago without knowing her name, and felt the thing that had been sitting quietly at the bottom of him for all those years rise toward the surface like something that had simply been waiting for the right conditions to breathe. She set the plate on the table there beside his. 2 plates, side by side. She did not look at them for long. She went to the stove and said, "I will make supper tonight," in a voice that was perfectly steady, and he sat down at the table and watched her move through his kitchen with the ease of someone who has already decided something, even if she had not yet said what it was. Supper that evening was cornbread and salt beef stew, and it was the best meal he had eaten in 14 years. He did not say that then. He thought it. They talked late into the evening, later than they had the night before, and the conversation moved into different territory, not the practical anymore but the more personal and tender. He told her about his family, a father who had been a decent man and a poor farmer in Tennessee, a mother who had loved music and had sung while she worked and had died of fever when Clyde was 17. He had come west at 20 with $30 and a horse, and the stubborn conviction that the land was the thing to bet on. He had been right, mostly. The land had rewarded him. But there were evenings in the first years that were so lonely and so long that he had talked to the horse more than was entirely sane, and he was not ashamed of admitting it. She laughed at that, really laughed, not just smiled, and he felt it in his chest like something warming. She told him about the loneliness of teaching, how counterintuitive it was. All those children, and yet you went home to an empty room at the end of every day, and the evenings were very long, and she had filled them with books and with writing letters to people far away, and with the conviction that if you could not manufacture certainty about your future, you could at least manufacture purpose in your present. She had been good at the purpose. The certainty had been harder. "Until you wrote to me," he said quietly. She looked at him across the table in the last of the lamp's warmth, both plates sitting empty and clean between them. "Until I wrote to you," she agreed. On the 4th day, she asked him to take her to the school in town. It was a Saturday, and Miss Alderton was not there, but the school was open. It was used sometimes on weekends as a meeting hall, and a neighbor woman who looked after it on non-school days let them in. It was a small, whitewashed room with 8 long benches and a potbelly stove and a blackboard at the front that still had some arithmetic chalked on it from the previous day. Naomi walked in and stood very still in the middle of it, and Clyde stood near the door and watched her. She walked to the front of the room and stood at the blackboard and put her hand flat against it, over the chalk numbers, and closed her eyes for a moment. "This is where I belong," she said, and her voice was so quiet and so certain that it did not sound like something she was saying to him. It sounded like something she was saying to herself, confirming something she had suspected. She turned around and looked at him. "If I stayed," she said, "if I took this position in the spring, is that something that would make sense to you, as a life?" He was quiet for a moment. "Teaching while managing a household," he said, "that is a great deal of work." "I know what a great deal of work looks like," she said. "I am not afraid of it." "I know you are not," he said. She held his gaze. "I am asking you something else, Clyde." He had not heard her use his first name before. She had been careful about that, as was proper, as the short length of their acquaintance required. But she said it now, and it sounded like something being set down, a weight being released, and he felt the last of his careful distance fall away like a fence that has finally admitted the season. He walked toward her across the empty schoolroom, and when he was close enough that he could see every detail of her face in the clear, cold light from the window, he said, "I think you have been the person that plate was for since before I ever put it on the shelf. I cannot explain that any better than I can explain why I put it there, but I believe it is true." She looked at him for a long moment with those clear, steady eyes, and he watched her deciding, watched her weighing it all, the land and the man and the kitchen and the plate and the 6 weeks of letters and the 4 days of learning each other in real space, and he did not rush her. He had waited 14 years without knowing he was waiting. He could wait another moment. "I believe it too," she said at last, and it was steady and sure, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard in his life. He did not kiss her then. They were in a schoolroom, and it was the middle of the day, and she was a respectable woman, and he was a man who believed in doing things properly. But he held out his hand, and she took it, and they stood there for a moment in the quiet of that empty room with the cold light on the windows and the mountains showing white beyond the glass, and it felt like the beginning of something that had already, in some form he couldn't quite name, been in progress for a very long time. There were practical matters that followed, as there always are. Clyde rode into town on the following Monday and spoke to Reverend Caldwell at the small Methodist church, not because he was a church-going man, but because the Reverend was also the man who performed marriages and kept civil records for the county, and Clyde wanted to be certain that whatever happened between him and Naomi would be done right and in the open, with no ambiguity and no impropriety. He explained the situation to Caldwell plainly, that a woman had come to visit and that he intended, with her agreement, to marry her, and that he wanted to do so quickly enough that her staying on the ranch would not cause any wagging tongues in town that might hurt her reputation before she had even had the chance to build one. Caldwell was a practical man beneath his clerical collar and told Clyde he respected the straightforwardness of that approach. Naomi, when Clyde brought it to her that evening, was quiet for a moment. They were sitting at the table after supper, both plates in front of them. She had been using the second plate since the night she found it, naturally and without ceremony, as if it had always been hers, and she had her coffee in her hands and she was looking at him with that particular expression he was already learning to identify as her serious thinking face. "You are not asking me," she said. "You are telling me what you want." "I am telling you what I want," he agreed. "I am asking what you want." She was quiet another moment. Then she said, "I want to marry you, Clyde Easton. I want to take that school in the spring, and I want to come home to this house every evening, and I want to eat my supper off that plate and wake up in the morning to see that light on the mountains. I want those things very much." She paused. "I also want you to ask me properly, not in a kitchen after supper, somewhere that befits the occasion." He looked at her. Something warm moved all the way through him like sunlight through clear water. "I will ask you properly," he said, "tomorrow." "Then I will answer properly tomorrow," she said, and the small, careful smile was back. But her eyes were warm with it this time, warm and soft and a little bright, and he understood that she was happy. He understood that he was too. He asked her the next morning, which was the 6th day of her visit. He saddled both horses before first light and had her up before the sun, led her out east to the ridge above the creek where the ground was high enough that you could see the full sweep of the mountains from south to north, and they sat on their horses side by side in the blue pre-dawn dark and waited. The cold was deep and clean. Their breath and the horses' breath rose in slow white plumes. Then the sun came up over the ridge. It was one of those mornings that are so extravagant in their beauty that they seem almost indecent. The kind of morning that makes you feel that the world is trying to convince you of something. The light hit the snow on the high peaks first, turning them to gold, then worked its way down through the lower slopes in bands of amber and rose, and that particular green gold that only the desert does in early light, and the whole valley below was flooded with it, warm and moving, the shadows retreating. Naomi sat very still on Pepper beside him, her eyes wide, her breath caught. He turned to her on horseback in the morning light and he said, "Naomi Quinn, I have spent 14 years on this land alone, and I have never not been glad to be here. But the last 6 days have shown me something I did not know I was missing, and I do not want to find out what it is like to know that and live without it. I am not a poetic man, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I will tell you this. I put that plate on that shelf and I kept it there for 14 years and I never touched it and I never understood why, and I think I understand now. I think I kept it because some part of me knew before I could know that you were coming. I would like to ask you to stay. Not as a guest and not as an arrangement and not as the practical solution to two lonely people's practical problems. I am asking you to stay as my wife. Because I think I love you already, and I believe that is the truth." She was looking at him with her eyes very bright in the morning light, and he could see her working to hold herself still and steady in the way she did, when something was moving through her more strongly than she intended to show, and then she stopped working at it and let it show. And her face in the gold and amber light of that morning was so open and so unguarded and so beautiful that he felt something crack open inside him that had been sealed for so long he had not known it was sealed. "Yes," she said. Her voice was thick with it. "Yes, Clyde, I will stay. I will stay and I will be your wife, and I would like that very much. I already love you too, and I have been trying not to say it too soon, and I think that ship has sailed." He laughed. He laughed the way he had laughed at her letter that day at the kitchen table, deep and sudden and unguarded, and she laughed with him, and the horses shifted beneath them in the early light, and the mountains stood gold and enormous all around them, and it was the beginning of everything. They were married on the 15th of December, 1882, 12 days after she had arrived on the stage from Santa Fe. Reverend Caldwell performed the ceremony in the church, which was small and cold and smelled of pine resin and candle wax. Eli and Walt Summers came in their good shirts, looking scrubbed and slightly overwhelmed. Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, who ran the women's sewing circle and was the closest thing Harrow Creek had to a social committee, attended and approved loudly of the entire business. Old Pete Birch from the general store was there, and the deputy sheriff Tanner, and a handful of other ranchers and townspeople who were the loose community of that small, windy place. Naomi wore her best dress, which was a deep navy wool that she had packed in the bottom of her traveling bag, not expecting to need it so soon. She admitted later, but bringing it because you never knew. She had her dark hair pinned up, and there were 2 small dry flowers tucked into the pin, which she had pressed from her traveling notebook where she had been keeping them since Abilene, flowers from a prairie she was leaving behind. She looked very beautiful. She looked, he thought, exactly like herself, which was the best thing he could say. He wore his good coat and his cleanest hat, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him up that short aisle, and felt a solemnity and a gratitude so large that he was not entirely sure he could contain it in the width of his chest. He said his vows in a steady voice and meant every word of them with a thoroughness that left no room for anything else. She said hers, and her voice was clear and certain, and she looked at him the whole time, not down at her hands or at the Reverend but at him, and he held her eyes and let the words land. When the Reverend said he could kiss his bride, he put his hands gently on either side of her face and kissed her, carefully, softly, as something precious should be kissed the first time, and the small congregation rustled with warmth, and Mrs. Hargrove made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a cheer. The celebration after was modest. Coffee and cake at the church hall, and Eli Summers produced a fiddle from somewhere and played 3 songs badly and 1 very well, and people danced on the wooden floor, and the stove threw good heat, and outside the December dark was thick and starry. They rode home together in the cold night, and the stars were extraordinary, and she was riding Pepper, because he had given the horse to her officially that morning as a wedding gift. She rode beside him, and the night was so clear and still that they could hear each other perfectly without raising their voices, and they talked the whole way home, not about anything in particular, just about the day and the people and the way Mrs. Hargrove had complimented Naomi's dress 3 separate times, and they were both laughing a little when they came down the last hill and saw the cabin with its lamp lit warm in the window, the way Eli had left it so they would not come home to dark. She stood for a moment on the porch and looked back at the yard and the bunkhouse and the range beyond, all of it silver and still under the stars. "My home," she said, softly, to herself as much as him. "Your home," he agreed. She looked at him then, and she was smiling, the full open smile, and he could see in her face everything that she was feeling and everything that was ahead of them, and he held the door open and she walked in, and the lamp was warm and the table was set with 2 plates. She saw them and stopped. He had set the table before they left that morning, both plates, side by side, as they had been every evening of her visit. She stood and looked at them for a moment, and then she looked back at him, and her eyes were very bright. "Hello, home," she said softly. To the table, to the plates, to the room, to all of it. He went to her and she turned into him, and he held her for the first time the way he had been wanting to hold her since the morning on the ridge, with real intention and real permanence. His arms around her completely, her face against his neck, and she held him back just as firmly, and they stood like that in the lamp-warm kitchen for a long time while the stove ticked, and the stars burned cold outside the window, and the mountains stood their dark watch over the valley. The winter settled deep around Harrow Creek in January, the way New Mexico winters sometimes do, with serious cold and several heavy snowstorms that kept the cattle bunched together for warmth and had Clyde and the Summers brothers in the saddle at first light every morning checking on the herd. Naomi had moved fully into the cabin and made it into a home with such quiet efficiency and such good instinct for what it needed that Clyde sometimes came in from the cold and stopped in the doorway just to look at what it had become, and felt a happiness so dense and quiet that it felt like something geological deep and permanent, laid down slowly over time. She kept her notebook, writing in it every evening at the table while he read or worked on the accounts. She baked better bread than he did, which he admitted freely and without ego, and she had taken to the cooking the way she took to most things practically, skillfully, with occasional experiments that were sometimes triumphant and occasionally not, and were always interesting. She found the corner of the shelf where he kept his small collection of books, a Bible he read rarely, a history of the Western Territories, 2 novels he had read so many times the spines had gone soft, and she added her own, a substantial collection for a traveling woman, books on natural history and education, and 3 novels, and a volume of poetry she kept separate from the others in a way that told him it was important to her. He asked about the poetry one evening, and she read him a passage from it, and the sound of her voice reading aloud in his kitchen on a winter evening was so unexpectedly moving that he had to look away for a moment to collect himself. In February, she began corresponding with the school board about taking Miss Alderton's position in the spring. The negotiation took several weeks and involved a trip to town to meet with 2 members of the board and a letter to the Territorial Education Office, and a good deal of patience on Naomi's part when it became clear that the board was not entirely accustomed to negotiating with a woman who had specific requirements. Her requirements were reasonable, a proper wage comparable to what a male teacher of her experience would receive, which the board resisted until she laid out her argument so clearly and calmly that there was not a graceful way to refuse it. Proper materials for the classroom, including new primers, which the board agreed to in full, and the understanding that the school day and school calendar would be at her professional discretion. They agreed to all of it eventually, and she came home on the evening of that final meeting looking satisfied in the way a person does when they have won something fairly. "They tried to pay me half what Alderton was getting," she told him at supper. "What did you say?" he asked. "I said that Miss Alderton had a year less experience than I do, and that the salary they were proposing was insufficient, and I read them the comparable figures from the Albuquerque district and the Santa Fe district and gave them the courtesy of assuming they simply had not been informed." She took a bite of her supper, entirely calm. They informed themselves quite quickly after that. He looked at her with profound admiration. "You are formidable," he said. "I know what I am worth," she said simply. "Most women are not given the opportunity to say so. I intend to use mine." He thought about that for a moment. "The children in this town are very lucky," he said. She looked up at him, and the warmth in her face was something that still, after 2 months of marriage, caught him slightly off guard in the best possible way. "So am I," she said. Spring came up out of the ground in late March, tentative at first, then with increasing confidence, the way spring always does in the high desert. First the smell of it, the green water smell of snowmelt in the creek. Then the color, pale at first in the grasses and the willow buds along the water. Then suddenly and all at once, the full occupation of warmth, the sky going from its winter white to a blue so deep it seemed to have actual depth. Naomi started teaching on the 1st of April, 1883, riding Pepper into town every morning at 7 and returning by 4. Clyde made sure she never had to deal with the morning chores before she left, and she made sure supper was done by the time he came in from the range in the evenings. And they had found a rhythm between them that was so comfortable and so natural that it sometimes seemed incredible to both of them that it had been built in such a short time. But Clyde, who thought about things like this in the long hours on horseback, had come to believe that certain things take no time at all when they are right, that the rightness is its own foundation, and everything you build on it holds. The children in town loved her, as he had known they would. He heard about it from the townspeople who came by his place and from the Summers brothers, who heard things in town on supply runs, and from Naomi herself, who talked about her pupils with the same fire and specificity he had noticed in her letters. This one who had a gift for arithmetic, that one who was reading beyond her age but would not show it because her older brother was sensitive about being slower. She knew them all. She knew what they needed and she gave it, and she defended them to parents who were sometimes dismissive of what children could or should learn, and she fought with cheerful tenacity for every book and every supply the school needed. And by June, there was not a family in Harrow Creek that would have parted with now Mrs. Easton. In June, she told him she thought she might be with child. He was mending fence on the east boundary when she came out to tell him, riding Pepper across the afternoon pasture with her hair coming loose from its pin in the warm breeze. He saw her coming and felt the familiar warmth of seeing her at a distance, that small bright thing his chest did now at the sight of her that he did not bother trying to be dignified about. She pulled up beside him and looked at him with a very specific expression, careful and wondering, and trying to hold steady, and said, "I think you are going to be a father, Clyde." He set down the fence stretcher. He walked to Pepper's side and he took Naomi's hands in both of his, her hands that were warm and rough-worked and real, and he looked up at her in the afternoon light and felt something so enormous move through him that for a moment he had no words at all, and she watched him find them, watching his face with those steady dark eyes, a little smile beginning at the corner of her mouth. "Are you pleased?" she asked, as if it were even possible to ask. "Naomi," he said, and his voice was rough with it. "I could not be more pleased if the sun had come down and given it to me in writing." She laughed then, that full laugh, and leaned down from the saddle and kissed him firmly on the mouth, and the horses shifted, and the afternoon light lay golden over everything, and the mountains stood their ancient kind witness. Their son was born in the early hours of a February morning in 1884, in the cabin, with the midwife Mrs. Yates present and Clyde pacing the front room in a state that Walt Summers later described, having witnessed the pacing through the window from the bunkhouse where neither he nor Eli had slept either, as a man trying to walk his boots through the floor. The baby was born healthy and loudly, and Mrs. Yates brought him out wrapped in flannel and said, "A boy, Mr. Easton, and a fine loud one," and put the child in his arms, and Clyde Easton, who had not cried since his mother's funeral, stood in his kitchen in the lamplight at 3 in the morning holding his son and was not ashamed of what showed on his face. He went in to Naomi when Mrs. Yates allowed it. She was pale and exhausted and very beautiful, and she looked at him from the pillow with her eyes soft and tired and said, "Well, Clyde, what do you think?" "I think," he said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed and putting the child into her arms, "that we have made something extraordinary." She looked down at the baby with that open, unguarded face that she still sometimes showed him in unguarded moments, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes," she said, "we have. They named him Samuel after no one in particular because they liked the way it sounded and because it felt solid, the kind of name that would hold a person up. Samuel Easton was from his first weeks an alert and curious child, dark-eyed like his mother, and with his father's tendency to be still and observant before speaking, which made him seem preternaturally thoughtful for an infant and made Naomi say, on more than one occasion that she was outnumbered by quiet people in this household, and she was not at all unhappy about it. Life at the ranch in those years had a quality of fullness that Clyde had no precedent for and which he tried occasionally to articulate, mostly to himself on horseback or at the fence line, never quite finding the words but feeling the shape of it clearly. It was not that nothing was hard. The summer of 1884 was brutally dry, and the creek ran low, and they lost some cattle, and had to sell more than he would have liked to cover the winter supplies. It was not that there were no difficult days. There were days when Naomi came home from the school tight-faced with frustration over a board member who questioned her methods, or days when the baby was ill and neither of them slept more than 2 hours, or days when the sheer weight of the work on the land pressed down hard. But those were the weather of a life, and the ground underneath was solid. He would come in from a long day on the range sometimes, in the long summer evenings, and find her sitting on the porch with Samuel on her lap, both of them watching the light go down over the mountains, and he would stand at the gate for a moment just looking at that picture. The woman and the child and the last light and the whole life they were living, and feel a gratitude so profound, it was almost indistinguishable from prayer. She would look up and see him standing there and say, "Stop looking at us like that, Clyde Easton, and come here." And he would come. In the autumn of 1885, he rode into town and came back with something wrapped in brown paper, and he set it on the table after supper and told her to open it. She gave him a look that was equal parts suspicious and curious, which was one of his favorite expressions of hers, and unwrapped it. It was 2 new tin plates, good quality, with a simple raised pattern around the rim. She looked at them and then up at him, and the question was in her eyes. "Samuel is getting old enough to eat properly at the table," he said. "But those 2 plates," he nodded toward the cupboard, where both of the original plates were stacked now, retired from daily use after 3 years of service. "Those 2 plates are not for eating off anymore. I thought they should probably stay in the cupboard." She looked at him for a long moment, reading every layer of what he had just said. Then she went to the cupboard and opened it and stacked the 2 old plates carefully side by side on the shelf and closed the door. "Yes," she said softly, "they should stay there." Yes. He came up behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back into him, and they stood looking at the closed cupboard door for a moment, and there was no need to say anything else about it. Samuel grew into a boy who was everything they might have hoped for, and several things they had not thought to hope for, being of that particular variety of child who reveals qualities in himself that you did not know you wanted to see until you see them. He had his mother's intelligence and his father's patience, but he had his own restless kindness, a powerful impulse toward the weak and the overlooked that showed itself first in his insistence on staying behind after school to help slower students, and later in the way he took up with the Navajo children who lived on the northern edge of the territory, and who came into town occasionally, teaching them his letters in exchange for words in their language, with a matter-of-factness about the exchange that his mother found both charming and deeply characteristic. Naomi continued teaching, year after year, building a school that was the best thing in Harrow Creek by most accounts, better funded, better supplied, and better attended than any school in a 3-county radius by 1888, which was a fact she would have been too modest to claim, but which the education commissioner who visited that year said plainly and in writing, to her enormous private satisfaction. She had fought for every one of those improvements with the same cheerful tenacity she brought to everything, and she had won them all. Their second child came in the spring of 1887, another boy, whom they named James, and James was from the beginning a different creature entirely from Samuel Louder, more immediate, full of a kinetic physical energy that had him pulling himself to standing before he was 10 months old, and had Clyde building a fence around the porch by the time he was 11 months because the child showed every intention of walking directly off it. He was a joyful boy, boisterous and warm, and the brothers were devoted to each other in that particular way of people who are different enough to be interesting to each other. In the summer of 1888, Henry Briggs came through Harrow Creek. He was driving cattle north and stopped at the ranch for a night, as drivers sometimes did at known properties with hospitable owners, and Clyde greeted him in the yard with genuine pleasure. Henry was older, heavier, with more gray in his beard than Clyde remembered, and he shook Clyde's hand and looked around the yard and the cabin and said, "Well, you look like a man who has been living well. Come inside," Clyde said, "and I will show you why." They went in and Naomi was at the stove, and Samuel, who was 4, was at the table with a book, and James, who was 1, was in the wooden high chair that Clyde had made the previous winter, and Naomi turned from the stove and looked at Henry Briggs, and Henry Briggs looked at Naomi, and then he looked at the kitchen. The calico curtain now faded and replaced twice over, the 2 new plates on the table, the children. The room that had been a lonely man's cabin and was now entirely and unmistakably a home, and he looked back at Clyde with an expression that was wide open with something between gladness and wonder. "I wrote you a letter," Naomi said to him, drying her hands on her apron. "6 years ago, you probably don't remember." "I didn't write any letter," Henry said carefully. She smiled. "I know. But you talked to a woman in a bar in Abilene about a cattle rancher in New Mexico Territory who was the most decent man between the Missouri and the Rio Grande." She paused. "That was me you were talking to." Henry Briggs looked at her and then at Clyde and then at the children, and then he put his hat against his chest and said, "Well, I will be." "You will stay for supper," Naomi said, in the tone that was not quite a question. And Henry Briggs, who had driven cattle through 4 territories and eaten more cold trail beans than he cared to count, said yes, with a feeling that he was sitting down to something considerably more significant than supper. After the children were in bed and Henry had been given the Summers brothers' spare bunk, and Clyde and Naomi were alone in the kitchen with the last of the lamp's warmth, Clyde opened the cupboard and showed Henry the 2 old plates sitting on the shelf. He told him the story, all of it, from the day he bought them to the day Naomi found the second one on her 3rd night in the cabin. Henry listened with his elbows on the table and his coffee cooling in front of him, and when Clyde finished he was quiet for a moment. 14 years, Henry said. 14 years, Clyde said. Henry shook his head slowly, the way you do when something is too large to argue with. "I have never been a superstitious man," he said. "Neither have I," said Clyde. "And yet," Henry said. "And yet," Clyde agreed. They both looked at the cupboard. Behind them, Naomi was writing in her notebook, the scratch of her pen the only sound in the room, and Clyde looked at her and felt the same thing he had felt on that first morning when he came out to find the coffee made and her at the table, and it was already, impossibly, natural, the sense that this was how it had always been, that the 14 years of the empty plate and the empty chair had been not a lack but a preparation. Henry Briggs rode out the next morning with 3 biscuits in his coat pocket from Naomi's breakfast, and a story he would tell to every fire for the rest of his life, and he did. The years continued in their good rhythm. By the time Samuel was 7 and James was 4, the school had expanded to 2 rooms and Naomi had a second teacher, a young woman named Clara Oates from Albuquerque, and the 2 of them together were a force that the school board had entirely stopped trying to manage and had simply begun to support, which was better for everyone. Naomi was 34 years old in 1888, and at the full force of herself, still the same woman who had stepped off the stage from Santa Fe with her traveling bag and her clear eyes and her steady voice, but more so in every direction, more confident in what she could do and what she deserved, and what she believed about how children and women and people who were different from those in power should be treated. She had gotten involved, quietly and persistently, in the question of the Navajo families to the north, who were dealing in those years with the ongoing pressure of the territorial government to move or restrict them. She had corresponded with attorneys in Santa Fe and with a woman's education organization in Albuquerque, and she had written letters to the territorial governor that were so carefully argued and so impossible to dismiss as merely sentimental that they had reportedly been passed around the governor's office with a mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. Nothing changed quickly, and she knew that, and she did not pretend otherwise. But she kept writing the letters, and she kept teaching the children who came to her door regardless of where they were from, and she believed, with a clear and stubborn faith, that the accumulation of small right actions was the only honest answer to large entrenched injustice. Clyde supported her in all of it, practically and without reservation. He was proud of her in the particular way of a man who has married someone better than his best hope, and he showed it not in speeches, but in the steadiness of his backing riding into town to post her letters, making sure she had the time and the quiet she needed to write them, telling the school board plainly that they would find her support unwavering if they were smart enough to deserve it. He had also, by 1889, built on to the cabin substantially. There were now 4 rooms: the original kitchen and main room, the bedroom they shared, a proper children's room that Samuel had painted himself with help from Clyde, and a bucket of whitewash, and what appeared to be a genuine artistic intention for someone who was 5 at the time, and a small room at the back that Naomi used as a study and called, with dry humor, her office. The porch had been widened and had 2 good chairs on it, and in the summer evenings they sat there after supper and watched the stars come out over the mountains, sometimes talking, sometimes not, the boys running in the yard until it was too dark to see. In the spring of 1890, their 3rd child came, a girl they named Clara Josephine, Clara for Naomi's teaching colleague and Josephine for no one in particular, except that they liked the way it landed. She arrived in April when the range was green and the air was warm with pollen and the creek was full and fast from snowmelt, and she was from her first moments a person of absolute decisive intensity, with a set to her jaw at 3 weeks old that made Clyde look at Naomi and say, "She is going to be extraordinary and also extremely difficult." "She is going to be exactly like me," Naomi said, and was satisfied with that. Clara Josephine was, in fact, exactly like her mother. She was also like her grandmother, the stern aunt from Abilene, though only in the strength of her opinions and none of the coldness. She was fierce and warm and curious and stubborn, and she had her father's brown eyes and her mother's dark hair and a laugh that came from somewhere very deep and very sure of itself. Samuel adored her immediately. James, who had been the youngest for 3 years and had settled into that role with considerable comfort, required a period of adjustment that lasted approximately 3 weeks, and then he too was gone, wholly devoted, dragging his little sister around the yard on a blanket and calling it a wagon. Clyde Easton, who had stood in his empty cabin in the winter of 1868 and put a second plate on a shelf for a reason he could not name, stood in the yard of his home in the spring of 1890 and watched his wife come out onto the porch with the new baby in her arms, and his 2 sons running toward her through the green grass, and the mountains standing luminous behind them all, and felt a gratitude so complete and so enormous that it went past language entirely and simply occupied him, the way weather occupies a landscape, filling everything, leaving no space that was not full of it. She looked up and saw him watching from the gate, the way she always did, and called across the yard, "Clyde Easton, stop standing there looking at us like that and come here." And he came, as he always did and always would. He came through the gate and across the yard and up the porch steps, and she put her hand on his chest, the baby between them, and looked up at him with those clear dark eyes that still, after 8 years, held something he could spend his entire life looking at and not entirely reach the bottom of, and he put his hand over hers and held it there. "Are you happy?" she asked. She asked it sometimes, simply and directly, because she believed in saying out loud the things that mattered. It was one of the many things he loved about her. "More than I know how to say," he told her, which was true. He was a man of few words, and the words available to him had always fallen slightly short of what he actually felt when he looked at her, which he suspected might be permanent, and which he did not mind. "Good," she said, exactly as she had said it on the very first day in the cabin, when he told her he had never not loved this place. "Good." He kissed her, carefully and warmly, there on the porch in the spring morning with the baby between them and Samuel and James tumbling around their feet, and the mountains blazing white and gold against the open sky. It was not the end of their story. Stories like this one do not really end, they deepen, year by year, each season adding a layer of meaning to the one before, the way the creek adds a ring of green each spring to the old willow trunks, until the trees are massive and shaded, and full of birds and children's initials. But it is the place where the shape of the whole becomes visible, the place where you can see from a height what has been built and understand its scale. 2 plates on a shelf, one man's unexplained certainty in an empty cabin, one woman's measured courage in writing a letter to a stranger based on another stranger's honest account of a good man, and 14 years of something kept ready, holding space for something that had not arrived yet, and yet was somehow already expected. Clyde thought about that sometimes, in the evenings on the porch when the children were in bed and Naomi was beside him, and the mountains were dark shapes against the stars, vast and unconcerned and permanent. He thought about the 22-year-old version of himself walking into Pete Birch's store with sawdust on his coat and picking up 2 plates. He could not explain it any better now than he could then. He had tried a few times to put it into words and had come up short every time, because it lived below words in a place that language only circles around without landing. But here was what he had come to. He believed that some things are true before they are proven, and some things are known before they are understood, and some things are loved before they are even named, and that the whole complicated, beautiful, inexplicable business of love is perhaps less a thing that happens to people than a thing that people are quietly prepared for, all along, in ways they will not recognize until later. A plate on a shelf. 14 years. And then she came through the door, and everything that had been waiting became everything that was real. In 1893, old Pete Birch at the general store sold his business and retired, and he invited Clyde and Naomi to the small celebration he held in his back room, and he raised his glass and said, "I have kept a lot of strange customers in 30 years, but I have never had one stranger than the young man who came in here in 1868 and bought 2 plates when he had never once had a guest at his table. And I want him to know I am very glad I did not ask too many questions." Naomi, who had heard the story many times now and still found it moving every time, looked at Clyde, and Clyde looked at Naomi, and they smiled at each other in the way of people who share a secret that has become the whole of their lives. By the mid-1890s, Samuel Easton was a serious and capable young man with a strong interest in land law, and an even stronger interest in the rights of the Navajo people whose land bordered the territory where he had grown up. He had, with his mother's characteristic directness and his father's quiet determination, enrolled in a law school program being offered by correspondence through an institution in Albuquerque, and he studied late into the evenings at the table in the kitchen, where his mother had once found a plate on a shelf, making careful marks in the margins of his legal texts, and writing long, thoughtful letters to his professors that his mother sometimes read over his shoulder and said, with great satisfaction, that she had taught him well. James, who was 16 in 1903, was a rancher through and through, with his father's feeling for cattle and land and a gift for the practical management of things that was already, at 16, making Clyde think about the future of the operation with great confidence. He was also, by this time, 6 feet tall and devastating to the girls of Harrow Creek, in the way that cheerful, capable, good-looking young men are in small towns, a fact that Clyde chose not to comment on directly and Naomi chose to handle with the particular combination of directness and affection that she applied to most situations in her household. Clara Josephine at 13 was already a teacher, at least in spirit, having appointed herself the instructor of every younger child in a 2-mile radius, and having established an unofficial after-school tutoring arrangement in the yard that made her mother laugh with recognition every time she looked out the window at the small congregation of children learning their letters from an entirely self-appointed 12-year-old standing before a piece of slate nailed to the fence post. "You," Naomi told her daughter one evening, "are going to be a force on this earth." Clara Josephine, who had her mother's dark eyes and her father's quiet certainty and the combined stubbornness of both, said, "I know," without looking up from her book. Clyde looked at Naomi across the table and found her already looking at him, that warm smile at the corner of her mouth, and he felt as he felt every day in this kitchen, at this table, in this life, the full impossible weight of his luck, and was not quiet about it in his heart even when he was quiet in his voice. The mountains were still there outside the window, the same mountains, bearing their winter snow and their autumn gold, and their spring green in the same patient rotation. They had been performing for longer than any human name for them. The creek still ran clear in the spring and low in the summer and ice-edged in the deep of winter, and the cattle still turned their heavy patient heads to watch you ride past, and the cottonwoods along the creek bank still turned gold in October and stripped themselves bare for November and stood black-limbed against the winter sky. And in the kitchen of the cabin that Clyde Easton had built in 1868, the one that had grown into a proper house over 30 years of marriage and children and good work, there was a cupboard. And in the cupboard, on a shelf where the dust had long since been cleaned away, sat 2 old tin plates, side by side. Simple plates, slightly dented, the tin worn soft where they had been handled, stored away from use now for the better part of a decade and not ever going back into service, because they were not plates anymore. They were something else. They were the record of something that had no other record, the physical trace of a moment when a man had known something he could not explain, and a woman had come to find it waiting for her. And every year, on the 3rd of December, the day she had arrived on the stage from Santa Fe, Naomi would take the plates out of the cupboard and set them on the table, side by side, and they would sit together after the children were in bed and have their coffee and remember. Not with sadness, but with the deep and specific tenderness of people who understand what they have and are not casual about it. They would remember the first supper she cooked, and the morning on the ridge and the snow on the mountains, and what he said to her in the empty schoolroom, and what she said back to him, and how the light looked on that December day when they stood in front of Reverend Caldwell, and said words that still, all these years later, felt completely true and completely new at the same time. They would sit together at that table, those 2 plates between them, and outside the mountains would be dark and the stars would be brilliant and the cold would press close against the window glass, and inside the lamp would be warm and the house around them would hold its full and breathing life, and Naomi would look at him across the table and he would look at her, and there would be nothing left undone, nothing left unsaid, nothing left unresolved between them. Only the continued and daily and permanent fact of each other, and the life they had made together in this place where the light was very good in the morning and the mountains were always there, and a second plate had sat on a shelf for 14 years, certain of something neither of them had known yet, certain and patient and right. The cottonwoods went gold and stripped themselves bare, and the creek ran, and the cattle moved across the range, and the children grew up, and the school in Harrow Creek grew, and the mountains were always there. And Clyde Easton and Naomi Quinn Easton grew old together in the way of people who have loved each other well and known it, and said so, and showed it, and built a life that was worth every hard cold winter, and every dry summer, and every difficult board meeting, and every mile of fence, and every letter written by lamplight in a tight, careful hand, to a stranger who turned out to be no stranger at all. And the 2 plates stayed in the cupboard, and the cupboard stayed in the kitchen, and the kitchen stayed in the house, and the house stayed on the land, and the land stayed true. And that was everything. And it was enough. And it was more than enough. It was, in fact, the whole of it.